I am absolutely thrilled to have you on the podcast. Rebecca Hinds, welcome to What's Possible.
Thank you so much for having me, Eileen. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, before Rebecca and I hopped on, I was saying to her that poor people in all my meetings today, and we're talking about meetings, and I've been in meetings all day, and everybody has had to look at the cover of Rebecca's book. They have to listen to me go on and on about her book. So now it is actually our listeners' time to get to listen to me go on and on about your book. And the crazy thing for our listeners, this is a book about meetings. That's not a very exciting topic. And somehow you made it fun. And I'm not sure how. My husband was like, "What are you reading?" I'm like, "Oh my gosh, it's the best book," which is so weird when you're talking about a book about meetings. So that is our teaser for our audience. However, we're not going to go there yet. Rebecca, before we dive in to a book that is all about meetings, can you share about yourself? Not all the formal stuff. We'll get to that, but just the fun stuff. Who is Rebecca Hinds?
So I think in many ways, it's hard to describe myself. I would describe myself as, a lifelong learner. I think at the core of it, and someone who loves to build. I've always had an entrepreneurial mindset forever. I thought I wanted to build my own business and start from scratch. And I think those two influences have been pretty stark in terms of my career progression. Always been fascinated by the science of how organizations work and a
Mm.
constant desire to learn more about how we can design organizations in particular that are more effective and productive. And then, as well, this lifelong influence in terms of constant iteration, building from scratch, rethinking the status quo in terms of how we build our organization.
Yeah.
And I think that that comes through in my research and work on meetings, but also more broadly in terms of how I think about org design and org progression and org change.
Yeah. All right. So now tell me, I know sitting in meetings is not what you do for fun. So what do you do for fun?
Well, sit in good meetings. I get a lot of joy, joy, and there's nothing better. There's nothing better than a good meeting. We've all felt
Sure.
them where you leave the meeting energized. You know that you've walked away with something you could have never accomplished in any other setting for sure. But I love learning. I love reading. I love writing. I've always loved writing. So this process of writing a book has been really fun. And outdoors, I was a competitive swimmer, so still love to
Mhm.
stay active and balance sort of the writing and the reading with physical activity as well.
Love it. Love it. Love it. Well, the neat thing about this book, not only do I love it, but if you look at all the people who have praised the book, it's like the VIPs, the MVPs, the whatever of organizations. You've got Kim Scott, Amy Edmondson, Adam Grant, all falling all over this book. So if that's not enough of a reason to run out and buy it, and I know I'm doing a huge promo, we don't get any money for for saying that you should run out and buy this book. But I am telling you, being an organization who works with large organizations and we do executive coaching, as you know, meetings are a huge issue. And so that's why I'm so excited about this. I want all of our coaches to read it. I want our leaders who we do coaching with to read it because it really can shift things. And I love how you corrected me and said, it's not that I don't want to be in a meeting. We can get really energized. And that can be the best part of our day is being in a great meeting. It's the meetings that are not great that are the problem. And so let's dive on into your book. I I kind of feel like I already want you to come back for a part 2. That's what I'm gonna say right up front because there is no way we will get through everything today. But let's go ahead and start. And what there's a few things that I liked in particular. At the beginning, you really talk about let's just start from scratch. We need a blank canvas with meetings. So it's not about, the title of the book is Your Best Meeting Ever. This isn't a book about purely designing a great meeting. Yes, you do
Mhm.
that. but you also talk about let's purge, let's get rid of the dead weight, the meetings that don't need to be there. And I really like that approach because so many books just talk about you could do this in a meeting, you could do that. But you also argue we don't need a vast majority of the meetings that are on our calendar. So, do you want to speak to
Mhm.
that for a moment?
Sure, and I think there are many components of this, but we know that meetings operate within a broader communication system, and there's a whole chapter in the book on systems thinking as well.
Mm,
And we
yeah,
often blame meetings for all the problems with work, but usually they're a symptom of a bigger problem, and that is a broken communication system. And often it's so broken that doing a sort of cleanse, calendar reset is enormously helpful, not just in saving the time, but also resetting some of our assumptions about what actually deserves to be a meeting. And what
yeah,
we consistently see with this type of reset is the behavioral change is fascinating because once meetings are on our calendar, there's enormous social guilt associated with declining a meeting, for sure taking it off our calendar. And so giving people that flexibility, the built in excuse where we're going to do this as an organization, everyone's on the same page, this is a healthy cleanse, it eliminates some of that social pressure in a way that, it's not just the time savings, it's resetting our assumptions about what actually deserves to be a meeting.
yeah. Well, I love that you talked about that in the book was doing like what Dropbox did. You talk about you give so many really rich examples of just deleting everything. But not only that, you also talked about, and I'm drawing a blank to which company, where they give scripts of how
Mhm.
to gracefully say
Pushback.
push
Mhm.
back, to gracefully push back on a meeting. So that is would be helpful to share as well.
Absolutely. And I think, the more we can normalize, and at the core of a lot of this is normalizing pushing back on a bad meeting, normalizing the fact that if you're in a meeting that doesn't deserve your time or you're not contributing value, making that explicit in terms of employees should feel free to leave the meeting is very, very healthy because again, you're minimizing that risk, minimizing the perceived social cost associated with leaving a meeting. So something like scripts. What's fascinating, Eileen, is more and more I'm seeing healthy uses of AI for this purpose, right? The more we can use AI to help us make a determination in terms of is this a good meeting? What could I say to push back on this meeting in a healthy way? We're deflecting sort of the risk and the blame away from us as humans to an
Yeah.
objective or a perceived objective entity in a way that again is lowering this sort of social cost associated with leaving a meeting or declining one or pushing back on one.
Yeah. So having AI help be your filter in a way is
Mhm.
yeah. It's interesting when I'm coaching a client, I often talk about when they're trying to decide what to bring into their life, what to let go of, just like meetings, what to bring in, what to let go of. We talk
Mhm.
about having a filter. What is non-negotiable? For sure, this has to be in my life. What do you definitely want to say yes to? What do you definitely say there is no way? And it almost seems
Mhm.
like meetings beg that non-negotiable structure and then the yes no.
And one of the most important things, and in many ways, the easiest thing an organization can do, if there's one thing, it's give your employees clarity in terms of what actually deserves to be a meeting. And so
Yeah.
I have a rule in the book that I recommend called the 4D CEO test. Essentially, a meeting should only exist if the purpose is to decide, debate, discuss, or develop yourself or your team. There's a second part test, but fundamentally, that's the most important filter. And that gives employees clarity in terms of not relying on meetings as the default solution to all their
Yeah.
problems because we do that for so many reasons because of the social reciprocity we feel in terms of reciprocating a
Yeah.
meeting invite with an acceptance and as well as the fact that meetings are so visible within our organization where we conflate being in meetings with importance within the
Hmm.
organization, and the knee jerk reaction is let's schedule more. Whereas if we start to give clear guardrails and boundaries in terms of what should be a meeting, that helps
Yeah.
employees resist the temptation.
Yeah, and I know you also talk about what should be a meeting and who should be in there. And
Mhm.
I know you talk about sometimes 7 might be the magical number of who's in there.
Mhm.
But when we start to get larger meetings and we do it because either we don't want to hurt feelings or we want to have center stage and let everybody know X, Y, and Z. And you talk a lot about people tuning out. And I had shared that
Mhm.
with a client of mine. I was talking about your book and I said, these meetings. And she said, it's really funny. I had started at a company and I wasn't included in a meeting. And I
Mm.
felt like it was FOMO. I had definite FOMO of not being invited. And she said, but then I learned why I wasn't invited and when I
Mhm.
would be brought in. And I think that's a lot of what you're talking about too, is having clear communication. This meeting is for this. And when we roll out X, we're going to be bringing these people in.
Mhm. You're exactly right, and that FOMO can be very dangerous. I worked with an organization a while ago, and they had the problem of people not. And one executive in particular had the problem of people not showing up for his meeting, and so he decided to minimize the attendee list so that it was, went from 10 people to 5 people. And all of a sudden, those 5 people wanted to show up for the meeting because there's
Of
this
course.
sense of FOMO. And so the
The
psychological aspect of
psychology,
this
yes.
is so important to recognize. And it's human behavior. We grew up
Yeah,
in tribes that human face-to-face interaction is so core to who we are, but we need to avoid, conflating that with actually getting things done in a business setting.
yeah, absolutely. So, one of my favorite quotes in the book, and I think it really hits home, and I have quoted this probably 10 times by now. So, for those listeners who I've actually chatted with you live, you have to listen to it one more time. But you said, these days, it's harder to expense a Twix from a hotel minibar than it is to call a meeting that costs 20,000 of other people's time. And submitting a $15 lunch receipt requires 4 approvals. But schedule a meeting that burns through a week's worth of salaries. No receipt required. That is
Mhm.
powerful.
And it's true. We all feel it, and in so many ways, it's remarkable. Any other business expense, any other business process, we're measuring it down to the decimal point. And yet, meetings, so often, leaders close their eyes, cross their fingers, and surrender to bad meetings as a inevitable cost of doing business when we need to be much more intentional. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean we need to measure every meeting, but being intentional about recognizing the time, the money, and the cost on employees, focus and sanity is absolutely important.
Yeah. That was powerful, and you went through several different examples and organizations, how they do look at the financial
Mhm.
cost of a meeting because you don't really think about it until it's brought to your attention, and then it really hits home. So,
Mhm.
we've talked a bit about kind of the cleansing, looking at what's out there, maybe doing a hard reset, maybe doing a soft reset, shifting the culture. So, we're starting to look at how to determine when we have meetings, when we don't have meetings. Now, let's say we've
Mhm.
decided these meetings are important. Now we want to make them good. And so there's a few different things that I was hoping that you could go into. Definitely the general tips of some things that might make meetings more effective, more engaging, and purposeful. But before we go more generally, I love how just thoughtfully you approach the hybrid scenario. And
Mm.
that is something that our leaders really do struggle with. As we're globally dispersed, how do you
Mhm.
feel, or how do you allow people to feel more included and a part of the conversation? And you bring in so many great ideas. I'd love you to share.
Yeah, hybrid meetings are so complicated. In so many ways, they're much more challenging to get right than definitely fully in person, but also fully remote because you start to have these status differences between the people in the room and the people remote. And, we've talked about psychology. So much of this is psychology. We have
Yeah.
a visibility bias. The people in the room absolutely have an advantage, several advantages over the people
Mm.
on the Zoom screen or hybrid. And so, because of that, as a meeting leader, you need to be really intentional. I often refer to it as, shifting the gravitational pull to the people who are remote and naturally at that status disadvantage. So, lots of different tactics, invite them to speak first, give them, it's
Yeah.
sometimes called the primacy effect, where instead of the people in the room speaking first, you're distributing that to the remote folks to give them, an early advantage in steering the conversation, optimize for their time zones if we're talking about time zone differences as well. Encouraging people to be camera on, that's really important,
Yeah.
not mandating it, but we know that physically seeing your face matters if you're not physically in the room. And then, encouraging them to contribute, having a buddy in the physical room can be effective, or having some representation of them in the physical room. So it could be, a note card on the desk. It could be an empty chair. I've seen it can be anything. There was a university in China who developed what they called a snot box, and essentially it's this robot that has a snot bubble that inflates more and more the more time that goes on, where workers haven't participated in the meeting, and so that sort of visible representation. But the goal is we can't forget the people on the call, and we need to actively, and that also involves designing the physical space, U-shaped meeting tables versus rectangular. All of these things
Yeah.
we need to be thoughtful of in terms of recreating a more equal playing field. And then number one, recognizing that if you're in a hybrid setup and you have certain days where people are in the office versus remote, thinking about meetings as a design challenge, not just, defaulting to let's schedule a meeting based on the open calendar slot. Think about what are those meetings where they are very emotionally charged. It's going to be more effective to bring everyone together in person versus these are the meetings that still should be a meeting, but they're less emotionally charged and emotionally valenced. Then we can probably shift those to be more hybrid and remote and still leave with a very effective meeting.
Yeah, I like how you had that chart. It was a simple, four square chart of when you could do which type of meeting.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I really it made me think a lot about how do we include people, and you just had great ideas for that. Now when we think about meetings in general, what are some key things that it's like these are low-hanging fruit, people do this in your meeting? What would you say?
So I often think about it in terms of there are four key dimensions of our meeting. So the length, the attendees, the agenda items, and the frequency. And across all those dimensions, we should be intentional about how we design the meeting. So length is often, a low hanging fruit in the sense of if you look at your calendar and most of the meetings are either 30 or 60 minutes, it's a sign you probably haven't designed your meetings intentionally. And it's natural, right? We accept the calendar's default, but we probably can get away with shortening a lot of our meetings and leaving the meeting more effective. And so something like as my colleagues Bob Sutton and Leidy Klotz have advised on the rule of halves as a start. So take one of those dimensions, we can take length and cut it in half. Take that 30-minute meeting and try doing it in 15 minutes. And you might cut too deep, But often it's only at the point where you have cut too deep that you realize what's essential and what's just been dead weight. And so that intentionality as a thought exercise or a practical, experiment intervention can be really effective. Unconventional meeting lengths, I've seen a lot of effectiveness with. I studied an individual in the book who ran 27-minute
Yeah,
meetings.
I love
And
that. Yeah.
that, you're jolting people out of inertia. And I've seen many leaders use this very effectively where, try shortening. And I did this with a masterclass this morning. Take a meeting and shorten it by 3 minutes and see how people show up to that meeting. I think what you'll see is people show up much more ready to engage or much more ready to have a conversation around, hey, do we need, even, the 27-minute meeting? Or what if we moved it
Yeah.
to 19 minutes? And you start to become much more intentional. Half the game here is that intentionality and recognizing we don't need to accept these defaults. We need to be
Yeah.
strategic about how we use this time because even a 5-minute cut down of a meeting, if it's a weekly meeting, it adds up pretty quickly for, the 7 people in the room.
Yeah, I that 27-minute, I love that. I actually am going to try it. I have not tried it yet, but you will be pleased to know, and my team, I'm sure, was very pleased to know. I had 2 meetings, Tuesday morning, so we just finished the holiday break, and this has
Mm.
been a week. You and I both talked about being in meetings or a podcast in your case all day long, and I looked at the calendar and I thought, we haven't even had an opportunity since last time we met to have any new information arise at all. Why are these meetings on our calendar? They're initiated by me. I have the control to take them off. So I
Yeah.
sent everybody a message and I said, unless you have something you'd like to talk about, I'm always happy to hop on a call with you. But these meetings are
Mhm.
canceled for this week because I'm assuming there's no new information to share.
And it's so healthy, and so that's the frequency dimension of the 4 dimensions, and it's a very healthy exercise again to say, "Hey, if this meeting is weekly, let's try not having the meeting next week, and let's see." Probably what we find is we're able to move work forward much more effectively than perhaps having that meeting, and it's another good way to sort of course correct when we see we just have ballooning meetings and a lot of legacy meetings that perhaps it was valuable to have this meeting a year ago at a weekly cadence. Now we've developed new ways to communicate and new asynchronous ways to communicate. Probably we now can meet once a month instead of once a week.
Yeah. You also talk about the one-to-one meeting, which I really
Mm.
appreciated. The manager having a meeting with the direct report. I'd love you to share a little bit about that, of how to make that more effective as well.
Yeah, there are several important components of these. First, we need to have them. And increasingly, we're seeing this narrative, and it's been driven by several CEOs, but in particular, Jensen at NVIDIA has made a statement. He's an amazing leader, and he doesn't have one-on-one meetings, and he has, I think, 50 or 60 direct reports. And so that has sparked this narrative around, oh, we don't need one-on-one meetings. We absolutely need one-on-one meetings. Certain leaders are so good at other things that they can still be effective and their teams can still be effective. Jensen in particular gives his team a ton of clarity in terms of business objectives, and they have a really strong muscle for a lot of the work that traditionally one-on-one meetings would accomplish. But there's nothing more important for a manager to do, and there's lots of research to suggest that one-on-one conversation is incredibly important. Even if it's 15 minutes once a week, it's incredibly important. And don't cancel without telling your employee why you're canceling. There's a lot of fear and uncertainty around that as well. But most importantly, the attendee, the direct report, should be driving the agenda, right? This isn't an opportunity for the boss to get updates from their team or disseminate information to their team, the attendee, the direct report, should be the one who's designing the agenda according to what's going to be most valuable for them. In the book, I talk about Bill Campbell, who is a famous Silicon Valley executive coach, and he used to advise that the direct report and the manager both bring 5 things they want to talk about in the meeting. And that can also be effective because if the direct report is bringing 5 completely different things that are top of mind to them to the meeting versus the manager, that's a sign there's also misalignment. And so often, having that gut check in terms of, okay, my employee is bringing these 5 top of mind priorities to the meeting. They're not exactly what I would, propose as a manager. It's also a way to figure out, okay, why is there a misalignment? And
Yeah.
usually it's involving something that needs to go beyond the one-on-one meeting.
Oh gosh, so many good things. All right, the one thing that I need to also just highlight with the brightest, most fluorescent highlighter that I loved that you put in there because it's how I do my executive or it's how I do coaching calls for some of my clients who are up for it, and it's walking. I am a
Mm.
huge fan of walking meetings. And what I loved is you talked about the research on divergent and convergent, which when I was in grad school more recently, we did a whole presentation on the article on divergent and convergent thinking and
Oh,
how walking impacts primarily that divergent thinking, where we want to come up with many
mhm.
different solutions. But talk a little bit about your research. And the only reason I'm saying that is because then all of my clients, I'm going to cut and paste this segment so that they know why walking meetings are so powerful.
Well, the research is pretty clear in terms of if you're wanting to optimize for that divergent thinking, if you're wanting to be creative, walking meetings do enable that in a way that seated meetings don't or stationary meetings don't, because they often encourage what's called cognitive wandering, right? Where, we're looking at the tree, we're looking at our stride, we're looking at, our pacing relative to the other person, we're drawing connections and unique, perspectives that we wouldn't if we were in a stale conference room. And so in particular, if we're trying to be creative, those walking meetings can be enormously generative or trying to build relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so powerful. And also it helps to reduce that stress too. Like if you're
Mhm.
you can do it also virtually. So you don't need to be in the same office, but if you are in the same office physically, just walking together can lower the cortisol level if you're feeling stressed about having a conversation with someone. Go out for a walk with them.
There are so many benefits in terms of, greenery. There's a lot of evidence that
Yeah.
plants and greenery
Nature. Yeah.
difference. The water movement makes a difference. Fresh air makes a difference as well. Lighting, natural light. There's a section in the book where I walk through, the different aspects of the environment that matter for our meetings, and walking has, so many of those components that we don't often find in a conference room.
Yeah. I could talk about that. That is we're okay, now I think we have 3 extra podcasts coming up between you and me, so we could dive
Even
deeper.
what I could talk about, and I talk a little bit in the book, but I would love to devote, more time to studying this, is the color. Color, we know, has weird psychological powers in terms
Oh,
of blue versus orange. Blue is more calming, the color of water. Orange is more energetic, shows, strong associations with collaboration. Green is growth
yeah.
and teamwork, and all of these, they seem trivial, but the research, points to just how powerful they can be. And something as simple as, a different colored wallpaper on the meeting room or bringing in that accent chair can make a big difference. And, we see
Yeah.
organizations, they're few and far between. Adobe is one,
I read
Amazon
that
is
in your
one,
book. Yeah.
where they do invest, and they invest, big dollars because the research would suggest it makes a difference.
Yeah. I would imagine, seriously, besides all the extra podcasts that you and I will do, there are gonna be spin-offs of your book because it seems like
Mm.
you could dive deeper into so many different aspects of what obviously what makes a healthy organization, but even where we hold our meetings and how you can set that up for
Mhm.
success. I do have one question as we think about, maybe whether it's purging meetings from our calendar, shortening meetings from our calendar, deciding, you know what, we don't really need this. We could do it asynchronously. We also are a society right now that's really challenged with connection and
Mhm.
belonging and feeling a part of something and
Mhm.
being a lot of people working remotely. And I'm hearing this more and more from younger people feeling like I just want to be with people. And so
Mhm.
what are your thoughts on that? Because sometimes we have meetings to also connect. And so it might feel like a waste of time when it might be one of the most important things we're doing all day. So I'm curious.
It's so important, and I think I'm starting to see, several articles come out too in terms of how 2026 is gonna be the year of offline connection. We're also, have this hunger for
Yeah.
offline connection
Yes.
versus virtual,
Yes.
and it totally makes sense, absolutely, and there's a reason why, the 4th D of the 40 test is develop, because we need to have those meetings where we're developing ourselves and our team, and so, in
Yeah.
particular, team bonding, collaboration, it has never been more important than now with AI as well, because we're
Yeah.
bringing on, a new entity to our team in a way that fundamentally poses a risk and a threat to human to human
Yeah.
relationships.
Yeah.
We often don't appreciate just how threatened employees are by
Yeah.
AI joining the team. And so it's so important. Now, that said, often what I find is a meeting, and the research would suggest that a meeting isn't often the best way to develop connection if that's the primary purpose of why you're meeting.
Yeah.
Usually, bonding over a shared interest, a personal interest. We know sometimes they're called multiplex relationships, where we want to develop connections with our colleagues on a dimension outside of work. That's really important.
Yeah.
So, going to dinner, going to a show that you both enjoy, volunteering. There's evidence that volunteering
Yeah.
together can develop those relationships
Yeah.
disproportionately more strongly than other activities. But often, we shouldn't think of meetings as the only channel to develop relationships. If it is developing team bonding relationships, often a meeting is the right avenue. But if it's developing connection, there are other tools at
That
our
makes
our
sense.
disposal as well.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. So, if you were, and I realize we are talking right before the book's going to drop, it's dropping in less than a month. So, my guess is it's signed, sealed, delivered on your end. You've washed your hands of doing anything else. So, if you were to think of, oh, I would have loved to have included a chapter on, what would
Mm.
that be?
I do. I thought long and hard about the 7 principles, and I'm pretty convinced that all of our dysfunctions associated with meetings and the solutions can be bucketed in terms of those 7 principles. What I find myself wishing is we see more and more research come out every day, and research that I'm working with
Yeah.
some phenomenal companies on in terms of AI and meetings. And that is an area that is both so important and still so poorly understood.
Yeah.
It's fascinating what we're seeing in terms of what happens when AI joins the meeting, what happens when you now have visibility into all of these different behaviors, how charismatic you are in the meeting, how much you're talking, whether people are multitasking. And that is fascinating. So I think a book can be written, and I'm sure a book will be written in terms of specifically how do we think about the role AI can play in our meetings. Chapter 7 of my book is has a lot of that, a lot of I think the foundational aspects, but still there's much more that we can learn and should learn.
One other thing that I think is a whole nother book for you, and you do talk about it, but when we move, if we're getting rid of meetings meetings that we don't need, that we can do asynchronously, and we're moving them to Slack or that we're moving them
Mm,
to emails, that is getting, I have so many people I know that they say, and you even address this your book, where it's like, okay, I've been in meetings all day. Now I need to start working. And
Yeah.
first off, meetings were work and we forget that. But now we're
Mhm.
starting quote unquote work going through our emails at 4 o'clock. And I kind of feel like I would love a book. Of course, this is now my request, a full book
Mhm.
on that. It's how do we start to create guidelines and a culture around what we're emailing people. And maybe we're purging all the emails and starting from scratch again with a new system. So I'm
Mhm.
curious on that one.
It's such an important point, and we need to, there are so many aspects of our workplace that we need to fundamentally rethink. Email is another
Yeah.
one where, when we think about both email and meetings, they've been around in our organizations for decades and decades and decades, largely unchanged. That should not
Yeah.
be the case when we think about every other aspect of our organization. And now, especially with AI, we should be, even if we do continue to rely on email, and we probably will because of human nature, we should be using AI in a way that can, filter intelligently such that
Yeah.
we don't want AI to automatically, generate our email responses, but probably for 40 to 70% of them, depending on who you are in the organization, AI can take that on. And then that
Mm.
frees
Yeah.
us up as humans to spend our time crafting and responding to the emails that really require our unique human capabilities and empathy and trust. And so I think the most important sort of calculus individuals, teams, and organizations need to be making right now is, what is that division of labor between humans and AI?
Yeah.
And how do we be really thoughtful about where AI is and isn't injected into the process?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. In graduate school, they were saying, we want you to use AI for your busy work, not to
Mhm.
steal your
Yeah.
brain. And that's
Mhm.
really what I hear you saying is what is busy work? What is kind of routine that's not going to be something that needs more thoughtfulness, intentionality, more strategic thinking, high level thinking that we really
Mhm.
do want to do as humans versus something that's an easier task.
Yeah, I think that it's the first step for sure. And any
Yeah,
organization I work with, find the busy work, find the drudgery. For sure, don't automate the things that people want to keep human and meaningful. And we're seeing that overwhelmingly right now. If you do that, make sure you're replacing it with things that employees also find meaningful. But what we're actually seeing in terms of the high performers is the high performers are keeping the thing that they're uniquely good at as high performers human, and they're
mm,
automating everything around that. So
yeah,
it's not just even the drudgery, it's what are the things that I am not a superstar, it's not my special sauce. They're
yeah,
automating
yeah,
everything around that, and I think that's, the type of calculus once we move beyond the drudgery, because that's gonna be democratized. How can we think
yeah.
about us as individuals and what we bring to the table as humans?
Yeah, I love hearing that from a positive psychology background. We're always saying lean into your strengths. People spend so
Mhm,
much time trying to develop something either that they can't stand or that they just don't maybe have the same capacity for.
mhm,
And so they put all that energy there when really we could be leaning into what is our secret sauce? What's our superpower? And let's just hit it out of the park with that. And then
mhm.
either delegate to another human or AI for some of the other things.
Mhm, and it's so exciting, right? It's so
Yeah.
exciting to think that, as a creative person, you can now tap into AI for some of the technical coding aspects and, amplify that superpower in a way you've never been able to. But
Yeah.
we can't be cognitively offloading to the AI. It's not gonna do us very much good.
Yeah, it doesn't serve us well.
Mhm.
Absolutely. So, as we wrap up, if you were to think of one huge takeaway that you hope our listeners leave with, what would that be?
Intentionality. I think, it seems simple, but the act of being intentional with how we design meetings,
Yeah.
positioning yourself as a co designer of better meetings. Everyone is a co designer of better meetings. And the premise of the book is our meetings are the most important product in our entire organization. They're the most expensive as well, and they're the least optimized. And so the opportunity we have just in terms of being intentional, go to your next meeting and think about has this meeting been intentionally designed across those 4 dimensions? I think even just that healthy gut check can help us adopt a more intentional mindset around how do we fix this very broken, dysfunctional practice that we all suffer from.
Yeah, I have to quote you one more time because you do talk a lot about product, and would we
Hmm.
treat a product like we treat meetings? And you said no halfway decent product team would ship something that frustrates users, puts them to sleep, or solves problems nobody has. Yet meetings do that exactly that every day.
And especially when we think about, that user centricity, the best products, if you're any product team on the planet, right, you're thinking about designing that product for the user. But when we think about meetings, so often we're not designing them, or we're designing for ourselves as the organizer, where the purpose of a meeting should be, to create a collaboration space that deserves attendees' time and is a good investment, and we should be
Yeah.
designing with, that user-centric mindset as well.
Yeah. All right. One mindset shift, and you can tap into what you just said because that also is a mindset shift.
Sure, it is a mindset shift. So I'll choose another one that I'm
Okay.
also passionate about, and this one comes from my two amazing colleagues, Bob Sutton and Leidy Klotz. So Leidy Klotz, he wrote the book Subtract, and has done amazing research on the power of subtraction. So we know that as humans, we're hardwired to solve problems through addition. We see this every day. We
Yeah.
have a problem, we throw more money at it, more people at it, more meetings at it, more people in the meetings, more attendee items. But what Leidy's research shows is when you prime people to subtract explicitly, it dislodges that addition sickness, as Bob
Mm,
calls it, and we start to become subtractors. And what's fascinating is it's not that we as humans hate subtraction, it's often that it doesn't even occur to us that it's on the table. And so when we
yeah.
think about meetings, before adding that extra meeting or those extra 5 minutes, just as the 27-minute guy did, think about, can we subtract? Can we subtract a minute, 2 minutes? Can we subtract from the cadence, from the attendees or agenda items, and design better meeting cultures through subtraction rather than addition?
Yeah. With clients, they'll talk about their to-do lists and I'm like,
Mm.
how about you also have an undo list? And that's
Hmm.
that subtraction
I love
because
that.
as humans, we're constantly adding to our to-do list. There's only one of us. So
Hmm.
let's undo. And that undo again could be delegating. It could be like, this doesn't need to be done by anybody. So that
Hmm.
subtraction.
The
Yeah.
other one I like is the to don't list, right? What
Oh,
are you
to
not gonna do? I think for for
I like
the,
that.
for meetings in particular, I think having a to don't list in terms of what you're not having a meeting for, hopefully, everything that's not on the 40 CEO test can also be healthy.
Love that. All right. And let's see, and we kind of, well, not kind of, we already did low hanging fruit, but let's do another low hanging fruit. When somebody leaves today and they look at their calendar and they see nonstop meetings, what's one thing
Mhm.
they can do out of the gate?
I mean, the meeting doomsday is the best, most effective way to solve that. But if you're not ready, or if your team or organization isn't really ready to do a calendar cleanse, pick one meeting. Start with one meeting. And whether you're the organizer or there's some organizer that you can talk to, try to either remove that meeting from the meeting or from the calendar, or redesign it to be more effective. And if that's too much, pick one of those 4 dimensions: the length, the cadence, the attendees or the agenda items, and try subtracting from one of those dimensions. Pick a dysfunctional meeting and try that.
Yeah. Well, and what I really like is it goes back to control what you can control. If you have control over
Hmm.
this is what you want to dive into. And I'm going to ask a bonus question along those lines. When we want to shift a culture, it's hard when you're just one employee. What
Hmm.
might just one employee do to start to get the ball rolling for a culture shift?
So it's such a great and important question. it's so dependent on the organizational culture. If you're an
Yeah.
employee, you have status within the organization, or you're in an organization where there's a culture of psychological safety, then, you go to the head of HR, which I've done in my career, and said, "Hey, let me help, fix this problem, or let me work with you on this problem." That's the best case. There are other tactics depending on how safe you as an individual feel within the organization
Yeah.
or among people. Leaning in with curiosity is one effective tactic. I've been inspired for many years by Amy Edmondson's research
Yeah.
on psych safety. And so she'll say, you know, frame your pushback in terms of curiosity. Why are we doing it this way? Why are we spending half the meeting on status updates? That can be a way to sort of disarm the sense of threat. And increasingly, I'm seeing the use of AI. The more we can deflect the blame or the perceived blame or threat to a perceived objective technology, that also helps. So, ask the AI, how effective is this meeting? Why is this meeting? Why is this meeting ineffective? How could this meeting be improved? That's a way to then present that to the organizer as, perceived objective feedback rather than your human feedback that could be taken as a sense of threat. Again, it's highly dependent on the level of psychological safety, and ideally, we have cultures where pushing back on dysfunctional meetings is the norm and
Yeah.
expected.
Yeah. Well, and it makes me think of in positive psychology, we talk about appreciative inquiry, and it's what would you
Mm,
prefer to see? And so, if you can maybe even think about, gosh, I'm wondering if we can make these meetings even more effective by doing X, Y, and Z.
mhm,
So, kind
mhm.
of outlining that vision.
Yeah, and leading the change is also really
Yeah.
effective. Bad behaviors spread faster than good behaviors, but good behaviors do spread. And, if you can come, especially if you're an individual contributor, new to an organization as well, if you can come to meetings showing up, showing that you've intentionally designed the meeting, you care about the investment of time, that does a lot of positive,
Yeah.
reinforcement in terms of encouraging other people, especially if they've sat in that meeting, to then feel a sense of obligation to also design meetings that respect other people's time.
Yeah. Wow. I thank you so much, Rebecca Hines, for joining me on What's Possible. And if our listeners are not convinced yet, let me just leave you with Adam Grant's quote. This book should be required reading for anyone who runs meetings. So, the book we're talking about is Your Best Meeting Ever by Dr. Rebecca Hines. Thank you for joining me on What's Possible.
Thank you so much. I've loved the conversation.